The following video is a conversation with Balaji Srinivasan. He's the author of a brand new book, The Network State. In this conversation, we do a little bit of a history lesson. We talk about the network state, how it works, why it's so important, and how Balaji anticipates this coming to fruition. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I could have talked to Balaji for many more hours. Don't forget that these episodes are brought to you by FTX US. You can click on the link in the description to learn more about their offering. Let's get into this episode with Balaji and hope you guys enjoy it. All right, everyone. I'm very excited about this. Balaji is here, the network state. I feel like I could just turn it over to you and you could give us a lecture, but maybe we could just start with this idea of the network state itself. Like, how does this happen? How do we go from where we are today to one of these being created and actually scaled on a global basis?
Okay, great question. So, the book's at thenetworkstate.com. And so I think one way of talking about it is first, how does this thing happen? And then second, what happens after it happens, right? So how does it happen? Well, there's a bunch of, so first, what are we even talking about? So the network state, I've got both a short informal definition, then a longer definition. So the informal definition is a network state is a highly aligned online community with the capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. Now, the thing about that is a network state does not yet exist. One of the points I make in this is there's a lot of adjacent things. There's a lot of things that are like similar to network states in a sense, but like Google is not yet a network state. Bitcoin is not, a DAO is not. They're adjacent, but they're not the same thing. And the reason is that they aren't, there's various ways in which they sort of fall short of the definition. For example, Bitcoin has, obviously it has, the reserve currency, but it doesn't have a government, doesn't have land. Bitcoiners, don't agree with each other on many things. It doesn't have the national consciousness that is, what really defines a country. Even the term, by the way, nation state, I talk about this a fair bit in the book. You've heard that term before, but do you know what the difference between the nation and the state is?
No, what is it?
So most people don't think about that, right? In fact, there's a reason for that, because nation comes from the same root word as like natality. So it's like common birth, right? Mm-hmm. Common descent, common ethnicity, like the Japanese the Japanese nation is a group of people, the Japanese people. And then, by the distinction is the Japanese state is like a government that sits over those people. And, that Japanese nation could have many different kinds of governments. It used to have, the empire, like Imperial Japan. Now it has like, liberal democratic Japan, but it's like this very thin layer of like a government on top of this enormous body of people. And that is the nation, right? So there's the nation and then the state on top of it. And the reason that we don't usually think about that distinction is actually our language and our culture tries to ally the distinction, because the state, it legitimizes itself as a representative of the nation. For example, when you talk about national security, or this is happening at the national level, right? Or international relations and whatnot, right? Much of that is really interstate relations. When you talk about a multinational corporation, it's really like a multi-jurisdictional corporation because it's operating in multiple jurisdictions. And like, just to clarify, what is a nation? For example, I mentioned the Japanese nation, but the Kurds are a nation. The Catalonians are a nation, right? That's a group of people with sort of a common language and culture and history. But notice that the Kurds and the Catalonians are stateless nations. That say groups of people that are nations, but that do not have a state.
How important is having a state for a nation? Like, is it?
Oh, it's huge.
Huge. Okay.
It's huge. Right. I mean, the thing is, there's actually a funny quote. So just to kind of go after this word nation a little bit, you've obviously heard the proper noun, United Nations. Really, it could be called more like the selected nations, or the selected nations that happen to have states. Okay. And when you think about it that way, you're like, oh, wow, there's a bunch of ethnic groups that are really legitimate and have a lot of culture and history behind them, that in the game of musical chairs, that was sort of the mapping and settling of the world, they just kind of lost out. They didn't get a chair. The music stopped and they didn't get a piece of land to call their own. And so they are stateless nations. There's a book called Invisible Countries by Joshua Keating that talks a lot about these kind of folks. And there's groups like this all around the world. And there are varying sizes. Some are small, some are large. And the thing is that it was actually funny, like the president of Kazakhstan recently, he actually spoke against the concept of self-determination. Do you know why?
No, why?
He said, if the principle of self-determination is endorsed, we will go from something like 190 UN member states to something like 600. Okay. So there's this enormous jack-in-the-box pressure for people who want their own state. And, it would just go like this. And you just have this enormous energy of suddenly folks who were not able to self-govern being able to self-govern. Right.
Is this why you get like people like the Kurds and involved in such deep conflict, which appears to be over land and kind of this statehood that you're mentioning?
That's part of it, for sure. It's part of it, right? And many conflicts like this are over land, and that seems like impossible to solve. How would you fix this issue? And one of the key concepts behind the network state system that I'm proposing is, if you know enough history, see, lots of things today that we grew up with as constants are becoming variables, right? So, Pomp, you were born in early 80s, late 70s-ish? Right?
Late 80s. I just look older than I am.
All right. Okay, fine. Fine. So you are, basically my contemporary, I'm 1980. So the thing is that the stuff that we grew up with, for example, just take the US dollar, right? That was a constant up until basically 2009, and suddenly it's become a variable with Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. And various things like, the US world order, or, the things that people thought of as apolitical, when they say it's getting political, suddenly there's like factions back and forth on something that you never even thought there'd be a different opinion on. You thought was just so like fixed that no one would care. And that's now a point of contention, right? And so once you kind of realize this, that order that was constant is becoming a variable, you apply that to the nation state system itself. And, this has been around for so long that if, anything that you were born into is just kind of the way the world has always been. And you don't necessarily seek to question it, especially if it stayed constant for 30 years or 40 years or 60 years or 70 years. But, what preceded the nation state system? So there's a country called San Marino. You're Italian descent, right? Like,
correct.
Have you ever been there? Like, do you know San Marino? Ever heard of it?
Yes.
It's like this tiny little thing that's almost like a duck-billed platypus, like a missing link, between the past and the present. And San Marino, I may be getting the history wrong, probably, an Italian historian might correct me, but when Garibaldi was unifying Italy, San Marino granted him like a refuge, and in gratitude, he kind of left them out of his, unification thing, right? And most people don't know that, like, the French Revolution basically created France, and Bismarck created Germany, and Garibaldi created Italy. And these were giant feats of social construction. And in fact, nationalism was something that actually in some ways came from the left, at least with the French Revolution. Now it's identified with the right, but it came from the left as a way to make all people in this jurisdiction equal. And a lot of the people who we think of as, for example, speaking French, I think, what's his name? Eric Hobsbawm has a stat. I forget the exact number, but it's like small double digits, whether it's 10 or 20% or something of the territory of France actually spoke French, what we think of as a language French at the time of the revolution. And a bunch of other people spoke different dialects that got erased by the sort of imperializing campaign of the French Revolution to turn it all French, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know enough about the linguistic history to know how different those dialects were from French itself, or whether they were truly mutually unintelligible and so on. I'm relying on Hobsbawm's account, but I've seen similar things about the formation of Italy, the formation of Germany. So essentially what happened was that, there's this whole thing you can look at called the German question on whether, Prussia and, who was to take the lead in a united Germany? Was it going to be like Prussia or Hanover? And, all of this stuff happened well before people, today were paying attention or alive, right? But Let me see, I'm getting that right. Hold on. The German question, Prussia versus Hanover, right? The best way to achieve a unification of all or most lands, and like Little Germany versus Greater Germany, right? And I may be getting some of the details wrong, but the fundamental point is that all of these giant states, and they're actually pretty big, right? Like Germany's like 80 million people, like France is like, 60 million people. Like all of these giant states were constructed over the last few hundred years by guys like Bismarck, like Garibaldi, the French revolutionaries, and you can argue that Napoleon consolidated that revolution, and obviously the American revolutionaries, the Russian revolutionaries, folks like Mao who unified China. Even India was never a unified nation until basically living memory, like the late 40s, early 50s, like 1947, 1950. India actually, it wasn't just that they got independence from the British. There were 562 princely states that got merged into India. Okay, modern India.
So
India's like, go ahead.
I have a question about this exact time period where a lot of this started to happen. Is it driven by individual greed and ambition? There was one person said, hey, I want to unify all of this because then I can control this land. Is there something around a piece of technology, the invention of corporations? Like, why is it that we didn't have this until a certain point in time? And then it feels like the entire world kind of got unified in these almost like subcultures or sub-states. And it happened very sequentially and in the grand scale of things, very quickly, one after the other.
So, The Sovereign Individual, which I think is a good book. I actually have one thing is, the book that I've released, The Network State, think of it as a V1. I actually have, maybe under 300 or 400 pages of content that I've got, that I want to put in the director's cut. Okay. So it's only 460 pages right now. So it'll be like 1,000 pages. I'm completely serious. I've got graphs, I've got charts, appendices.
I do not doubt it at all.
Okay. So it's very much the V1. But one section I've got in there are, arguments and counter arguments to the sovereign individual thesis, because the sovereign individual thesis, I think, is quite good. But there's also counter arguments against it, which we can digress on or double click on. But just the sovereign individual thesis itself is that centralization increased. That is to say, technology favored centralization for several hundred years. And you had, for example, like join and die in the French and Indian War. You had the telegraph, you had railroads, you had mass production, you had mass media, you had these gigantic militaries that came from these centralized bureaucracies. All the stuff up until like roughly 1950 favored centralization. You built these giga states, absolutely gigantic empires, the American Empire and the Soviet Empire, the Nazis, the Japanese Empire, all slugging it out over giant quantities of territory because they're huge, returns on scale. And moreover, because the communications networks were so centralized, people couldn't argue peer-to-peer. It became very expensive to set up a newspaper or to get a TV license. It was highly regulated, highly constrained. So the whole thing got choke pointed through, and a few people could basically control massive tens, hundreds of millions of people. And then they just slugged it out in these huge wars of the 20th century. And the ideologies that they propounded were those ideologies that could basically script massive numbers of people, and then put them into war, basically. And the best of those was democratic capitalism relative to, communism and Nazism, but it was still a mass ideology that actually did, blow up a lot of people. It was, the least bad of them. I think I would agree. But if you read like Human Smoke or something like that by Nicholson Baker, you'll see it actually, had a lot of negative things. It's not just the Japanese internments, gold seizures. It's, all the stuff that FDR did, all the stuff Woodrow Wilson did, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So, point is, the sovereign individual thesis says that centralizing force or centralizing technologies, brought that together, and then decentralization has taken it down. I think that's true. I think it's also something where there's both sort of left and right wing forces that, as we would conventionally think of them, that happened during this time that were aided and perhaps only even feasible because of technology, but had a feedback effect with it. And there's sort of the left egalitarianism of, let us all be citizens. In the nation of France, nationalism was egalitarian relative to the monarchy. And then later it was nationalism as a right thing, which is we all need to band together in terms of defense. And basically, German nationalism in part, and again, I may be getting this wrong, maybe a historian will correct me, but my understanding is the Napoleonic Wars in part led to the rise of German nationalism, because people are like, we need to band together against this insane, French colossus. Like at the time, under Napoleon, France was not considered the surrender monkeys or whatever. They were, the military power of Europe, and Germany was actually the one that needed to get its act together. So there were various forces. It was technology, it was left ideologies, right ideologies. Net is you had returns on scale for a long time. And now we are seeing, with the advent, I think technology is probably the primary driver of it. We're seeing just massive, negative returns on scale, diseconomies of scale, and the whole thing is decentralizing. And it's decentralizing much, much, much faster than it's centralized. So it's like a centralizing ramp up over multiple centuries, and it's like decentralizing over the span of 1 century. Okay, so maybe 5x or 10x as fast.
Is this the idea of deglobalization? Is that's kind of how some people try to talk about this phenomenon, but you're basically presenting a different lens on it. But it's this idea that we're going to go back to a nationalistic viewpoint and there's less globalization.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think so. Deglobalization is interesting because I'm not sure it'll happen in exactly that way. So Zihan and other guys talk about that, right? And Zihan, I think, I probably agree with him, 30%, 20%, something like that. Probably very much disagree on other pieces, but here's my thesis on globalization, deglobalization, et cetera. First is, I think globalization continues online, but it goes in reverse offline. So you have physical nationalism, but you have digital globalization. And that's actually the tension of this century. It is the cloud versus the land. Mm-hmm. You have this global community of remote working, because on the one hand, you've got all these trends pushing towards total internationalism, right? You have cryptocurrency, you have remote work, you have Starlink, you have this massive global community of startup entrepreneurs and folks who are more connected than they've ever been. You have encryption, which is cross borders. You have you have all of those things. You have the metaverse coming. You have billions of people with smartphones. You have transnational companies. All of those are huge pushes on the digital side for continued globalization, and accelerated, in fact, in some ways. On the other hand, you have the land pushing against that, where various countries, various politicians want to retain their control over their jurisdiction. They want to use the state against the network, right? And so it's actually more complicated than simply deglobalization. This is a political axis of state versus network. And what's interesting about this is centralization and decentralization. You can actually cut that, where in some sense the state is decentralized because you'd have lots and lots of little pieces around the world if you deglobalized. On the other hand, within any jurisdiction, it's centralized. It's a centralized power, right? Mm-hmm. Conversely, the network, in a sense, is globally centralized because you have a central administrator of a Google or something like that that goes across the whole world. But it's also, in a different sense, decentralized because you can have Bitcoin or Ethereum or something like that where your private keys are local across different countries, right? So there's an interesting aspect of this where you can start slicing this. And I think it's more complicated than simply the world deglobalizes. One other aspect of this, which I think is quite important, is my mental model is a centralized East and a decentralized West. And then what we want is actually a re-centralized center. Mm-hmm. Okay. And why do I say it that way? So a centralized East and decentralized West. The sovereign individual thesis is quite good, but anything that's like a huge piece of the future, people often tend to just extrapolate that trend out, and they don't account for the Soros concept of so-called reflexivity. Have you heard about that concept? Do you know what that is?
One of the key concepts of finance, yes.
It was a key. Okay, why don't you explain it then?
Yeah, the whole idea basically is the further that things can move in one direction, they basically can reflexively move back in the other direction just as fast. And there's a balance, I think, and human psychology becomes a huge component of that balance and kind of the reaction. There's a reaction to every action in some way, and especially in financial assets where right when people are ready to sell, to walk away, to give up, that's usually the time where there's a snapback, if you will, of those assets.
That's right. And, the thing is, of course, sometimes things really just do go to zero. Sometimes things, actually venture capital's model, if you think about it, is buy the all-time high and hope it goes higher, right? That's what it is to be a Series A or Series B investor. You're basically, in a sense, buying the all-time high of that stock,
yes,
and then hoping it goes even higher. And you can make money that way, frankly, you can. But it is something which is it's certainly atypical relative to how a hedge fund person will think about it. The reason I just bring up reflexivity is, especially when it's a human trend, it may not go to infinity, right? The fact that it's rising often arouses bandwagoning against that trend, right? And so with respect to the sovereign individual, I think there's at least three counter trends, and those are, what I call the individual sovereign, the sovereign collective, and the autonomous robot. Okay, so the individual sovereign is like somebody like Xi Jinping or Putin or somebody, Elon, somebody like that who has like enough influence over the future that they can turn, even if the trend is towards decentralization, it's also a trend towards individual empowerment. And someone like Xi Jinping has pushed the entire country towards centralization of 1 billion people, right? So paradoxically, the sovereign individual talks about how individuals get super empowered. And here's a super empowered individual who is pushing the disempowerment of other individuals, which is very meta, okay? So that's like, the individual sovereign is a fly in the ointment. The second is the sovereign collective, because I think it's challenging I do think that the size of groups that you need to get something done reduces, but it doesn't it doesn't mean that you don't need other people for anything. It just means it gets smaller. You can do more things with autonomy. You can have things like Minecraft or Bitcoin with like one person, or Instagram and WhatsApp with double-digit numbers of people. That's all true. And I do think the size of groups, shrinks, and you have many more CEOs and many more smaller companies and so on. We're already seeing something like that. Many smaller countries as well. But that doesn't mean it goes to I think everybody is just one person, or even that there's a group of people that are just like one person. I think people want community and so on. So I think the sovereign collective is another important counterweight to that, because, the state will push back on you if you're just an individual on your own. You represent no constituency. The smallest minority is one person, I think, is like Rand would say. And that's actually why a pragmatist realizes, hey, if I can group with other people, I can probably achieve objectives, maybe by sacrificing some individual autonomy. But I think the sovereign collective is going to be a big thing, right? And that's crowdfunding, that is, Facebook groups, that is Signal, but it's also a big part of the network state. And the third is the autonomous robot, because a lot of the logic of Bitcoin and of the sovereign individual is, the 20th century was about these gigantic wars where, the states could seize all the money, and they could seize the money and they could use that for these, planes and tanks and kill each other. And, they could also inflate the currency, and all of that goes away when you have cryptocurrency, right? You've heard this thesis.
I have. Well, okay. And along these lines, one key piece I think that people don't quite yet understand.
Counter argument. Go ahead. Yeah, go.
Okay,
sorry.
But just to kind of hit home on this. So in the physical world, obviously, if you have the most powerful offense, you are the military dominant kind of nation state group, et cetera. When you push up into the digital world, there's still a lot of people who say, hey, atoms matter, right? It's not all just bits. Obviously, if somebody comes and takes your computer, puts you in jail, whatever, that's a problem. But there is this concept of actually in the cyber world, defense, the strongest defense means that you are more powerful. How do you evaluate offense versus defense in the physical world? And then does that change the evaluation in the digital world?
Yeah. So I think the way I kind of connect the two is I've got a section in the book called Rubber Hoses Don't Scale. Okay. So, people always say, oh, the rubber hose attack, haha, lol, you're just some moronic crypto guy who doesn't understand that I can find and beat you up and take your private keys. And then my counter argument against that is, okay, but can you do so at a profit? What I mean by that is the state is not, doesn't have infinite resources. It needs to first take that Bitcoin address or whatever address, and it has to map it to a physical person, and then find that person's current location, and then have, the search warrant or whatever that is valid in that jurisdiction, because they might be in, whatever country. They have to be able to then land the SWAT team. They have to go kick in the door. They have to find that guy's private key, and they have to hope it's got enough money to pay for that entire process. And then you have to repeat that over and over again. right? And if that, like a SWAT team is actually kind of expensive, it costs, I don't know how many, but like certainly tens of thousands of dollars. And you better hope that like that coercive seizure is making you more money than it's costing you, and that it's not resulting in film that will actually make a lot of people think, okay, screw these militarized police, abolish the police, defund the police, resist the police, whatever, right? And because if you do use force, sometimes the use of force is really complicated, because often the use of force, if it's considered illegitimate, can arouse significant backlash that is more, it's just stupid to use force, and so that's why rubber bullets exist. That's why nuclear bombs just didn't grow to infinity. Why did, for example, a while back, there's this guy, Eric Swalwell, he was like talking about how the U.S. government has nukes, and so therefore nobody can fight back against it. Do you remember this post or tweet from a few years ago?
I don't, but that sounds like something that would be on the internet as an argument and detached from reality.
Yeah. So the reason that's actually a really bad argument is if you actually think about, like, the point is not to just like randomly kill lots of people. If you nuked, just to take this stupid thought experiment, but is actually useful as a thought experiment in this sense. If you actually went and like nuked Dallas or something like that, you'd kill lots of his tribe as well, right? And it's not a surgical tool. Because it's not surgical, it can't actually be deployed, because his goal is to try and bring the other tribe to heel. And that means, basically going and killing or, attacking or censoring or deplatforming their guys without hitting his own guys. And so in fractal America, where if you look at the map, it's all these red and blue cheek by jowl, one side can't really like go and strafe and bomb the other side, because in physical space, they're so cheek by jowl that anything is going to hit the other person, right? And so that won't get political support from that side. And so instead, the warfare is online. It's very different than the 1860s. In the 1860s, you had these two tribes, and they weren't just ideologically separated, they were geographically separated. North and South were separated, right? You can look at the map. Whereas here, let me show you some visuals so maybe you guys can. The first is, that's a map of blue and gray, how they're separated in 1861. And if you go to the second one, that's how it looks in 2016. So physically, there's no way you can invade or bomb.
Yep.
The Swalwell tweet on nuking. Nuking just doesn't work. You're killing too many of your own guys, whatever tribe you're in. And then you go to the third, in the digital space, they're separated. That is actually, now that looks like the 1861 map again. And that's why it's so insane online, because you have, this front of two groups that are ideologically separated. But because the physical space is so fractal, any kind of conflict is going to look like, network war, as opposed to 20th century or 1800s war. And what does that mean? That's
Balaji,
go ahead.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is when I think of just from personal experience, right? So in Iraq in 2005 through like 2010, there was a program called Sons of Iraq. And what they essentially did was it was partially in the analog world of, we need physical soldiers, we need people to kind of patrol their local communities, et cetera. But there was also a psychological aspect of it, which is, you are an Iraqi citizen, you probably have some sort of military experience, or you have some sort of combat training or whatever it is. And we as the United States said to these individuals, we cannot patrol your whole country. We cannot be in every single local community. You have to take responsibility. You have to have pride in your country. You have to have a feeling of kind of responsibility for your local community. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to empower you. We're going to empower you in the analog world. But in some ways, that program was never recognized for the psychological component of trying to say, hey, if you don't want these people who you deem to be bad in your local community, you as the Sons of Iraq, you are responsible for, setting up checkpoints and keeping people out of your communities, et cetera. And we as the United States will help. Now, people will argue over the efficacy of the program,
sure,
but it was trying to combine the analog, we will give you weapons, we will give you training, we will, do all these things kind of in the physical world. But also psychologically, there had to be a kind of a step function change, if you will, in the way that people thought about their responsibility or their interaction in their communities. And, the proponents of this program would argue it was the turning point. right? It literally changed the kind of battlefield, because now all of a sudden you were able to multiply the number of soldiers. And it goes back to this idea of they weren't necessarily enemies coming at you, right? Because they were kind of more so agnostic and just saying, hey, like, I just want to live my life. I'm not on either side. But the United States was able to use these individuals to then be helpful for their cause, which, you know, I think is a past example. But now you're making the argument that that's going to happen on the digital front, not just in the physical world. We understand kind of what has happened in history, right, in terms of how we've kind of got here. Some people understand it better than others. But where do we go from here in terms of with these network states? Like, what do you anticipate will happen?
Sure. Okay. So fundamentally, what we're having is a situation where, because in part of the internet, but also because of trends that predate the internet, this broader decentralization thing, you have people in physical jurisdictions where that latent difference is now popping up, right? America is no longer really just it's not a nation state, it's a minimum, a binational state, right? Because you've got red and blue, but you've also got lots of sub-ethnicities and so on under that. We're not used to thinking of red and blue as ethnicities, but if you look at marriage patterns, for example, people will now marry outside their race. It's actually, you know, very, very common, at least as expressed to pollsters, but they won't marry outside their party. Okay, Democrats won't marry Democrats, and Republicans increasingly, or Democrats will only marry Democrats, and Republicans increasingly will only marry Republicans. That's been trending way up. And the thing is, in a generation, that kind of ideology becomes biology. It becomes, at a minimum, Democrat, Republican becomes like, you know, Protestant, Catholic, or Sunni and Shiite, right? The ideology becomes a biology if you're only going and finding a spouse within that group and telling your kids only marry within that group and so on, right? So that happens very fast. And then that becomes like ethnic, right? And that becomes like, I shouldn't say intractable, because it can be solved, but it's difficult, harder to solve, right? It's not really about policy. It's tribe versus tribe. And so the thing is that is like happening in a lot of places worldwide. And a lot of people don't realize that, you know, they don't know Garibaldi, they don't know Bismarck, they don't know what happened to the French Revolution. They don't realize like how much centralized force in different ways and propaganda, okay, the combination of both right and left in that sense, you know, was required to like flatten out these huge regions and centralize them under certain things. They kind of think that's the way the world always was. But there's an enormous amount of force and an enormous amount of propaganda that leveled all of that out, that kind of erased all these other dialects in favor of official French, or, you know, wiped out all these other small jurisdictions in favor of what we now know as Italy, right? And that was obviously cataclysmic in some ways, but it also resulted in what we think of as a modern world. And now we're getting, I think, the V3, right? So I mentioned San Marino, and it's like this duck-billed platypus. It's like this missing link where if you look at the history of San Marino, it actually shows why we exited the city-state age and went to the nation-state age. And a big thing, by the way, is city-state, nation-state, network state is a progression that's sort of similar to like gold, you know, fiat or dollars and digital gold. You know why I say that? Should I explain that?
Explain.
So the key thing is that like Bitcoin is a V3. We talk about it as digital gold, and it has some of the properties of gold, like the immutability and so on. In fact, it improves on some of those properties, the custodial aspect and whatnot. But it actually, and we sort of take this for granted, has many of the same properties as fiat. You can send it electronically. You can represent it on a screen. You can write programs with it, all that type of stuff, right? And if it didn't have those properties, it wouldn't really be a contender. It would not be, see, it's not a throwback. It's not V1. It's a V3 that combines aspects of both V1 and V2.
And
right?
the idea there is if it only had the aspects of V1 in a digital form, you would either miss parts of V2, which wouldn't make it competitive, or people would view it as inferior, given that they could send it digitally fiat. But if Bitcoin was somehow physical in nature or something, then obviously it wouldn't work in this digital world.
Yeah. So let's say it was just V1. Let's say it's basically like, you know, and by the way, I have nothing against Peter Schiff. I respect him for calling the, you know, mortgage crisis and so on, but he does like to troll Bitcoin, whatever. Okay, fine. So let's say it's gold. It's Peter Schiff's, you know, beloved thing. And actually, by the way, gold may have its own little boomlet or what have you. Okay. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the thing about gold is gold was defeated by the state, right? Executive Order 6102, gold was seized. Gold is something that you can detect with metal detectors. Gold is something that is very heavy to transport. Gold is something where you can't easily like chip off a flake and just use it at Starbucks, right? Gold is not a very easily negotiable instrument. It has lower liquidity than BTC, which is actually quite liquid, And so because of that, is Bitcoin as liquid as fiat? And can you pay with it as easily as you can a dollar? Not really, because there's various constraints on that. Like there's transaction limits and block size and all that type of stuff. Yes, you can use Lightning and what have you, and there's workarounds, I agree. But point is that gold V1, if you just tried V1, you wouldn't get that far, because literally physical blocks of gold are hard to actually pay with. You can use them as emergency storage mechanisms, but they're hard to transport. They're heavy. If you wanted to transport $1 million of gold, I don't know how many pounds that is off the top of my head, but it would probably be a fairly large amount of weight to carry, right? So V1 has a lot of downsides, which is why people go with V2. And so before Bitcoin, when people would just sort of be like, we need gold, we need to go back to sound money and so on. It was directionally accurate in some ways. There was a solid critique in some ways of the problems of the present, but there wasn't like the practicality of how does this new thing account for the fact that the present beat the past. If you have, the present beat the past, so whatever you propose as the future, it needs to be able to beat the present.
It's almost like combining, in some ways, the policies of V1, right, or kind of the structure of V1, but the technology of V2, and you put those two things together, you get V3.
Yeah, exactly. The specific fusion may differ in different domains, but the V3 has to be kind of better than both, right? And often, so I'll give several examples of this, and then let me talk about the network state itself. So, you have physical paper, and then you have a scan document, like a scanner. And then you have like a digitally native file, which never even exists in the physical world, right? Or you have, in a different way, you have paper currency. Then you have like a bank interface like PayPal, or that's a layer on top of a bank interface, but you see your dollars in a bank interface. Then you have cryptocurrency, which is natively digital. Or you have, you have a movie that you see offline, and then you have like a Netflix, streaming thing where, you've got a film that's in Hollywood. Then you have internet native content that was authored on the internet, and it's not like streaming from some like Hollywood library, right? And you can kind of think of a lot of things have this progression where there's like there's a physical digital hybrid, like a scan version, then there's a purely digital version. And so so that's a progression just within the internet. If we take a longer time frame, we say city state, nation state, network state. The reason that city states, the V1, were beaten by nation states is that nation states had scale, right? That's why San Marino is this ductile plebis. Nation states, like, they just scooped up all of these small principalities into this huge thing because it had massive scale. And the problem with people who are like, go back to city states, or, I want my small liberland, like my sea land, my small country, and so on and so forth. It's sort of like the appeal to gold, where I understand why they want it. Hey, let's have lots of small governments and so on. But those small governments, the past was beaten by the present for a reason. The present has scale. Those nation states have scale. They have offensive capabilities. City states were defeated by nation states. Network states, though, are a V3 in my view. And why? Because they combine some of the aspects of both nation and city states. So they have the scale or potential scale of a nation state, since in theory, you could have an international network that had, millions of members. In fact, take a look at, I've got a little GIF here, because, sometimes a picture
what you're basically talking about here, it's fascinating, because even if you look at something across industries, it really is, the analog world was a game of scale. And so naturally people would push into the digital realm. And if you take, books, right? There's physical bookstores that usually were mom and pops. Then there got scale by then going to the chains of the Barnes and Nobles, whatever. Then Amazon came along and said, hey, we have a digital version that gives us more scale. And then eventually what people realized is, like, we don't even have to create the actual physical book. We can just literally have a digital file. And so you can kind of see this progression across industry after industry after industry. And whoever basically gets to the end state the fastest and does it in a sustainable way, they tend to have the advantage, it appears, over the long run.
Taking a look at this, right? Let's keep this GIF on loop for a second. So this probably tells the story, like, in a few, frames faster than I could in words. So this is an example of a hypothetical network state that starts with one person in Tokyo, okay, and they recruit other people and they connect them together. And notice in the top right, they're crowdfunding territory, square meters of territory around the world to live together. And how are they doing it? In the top middle, the annual income is how much they're booking in, let's say provable, it could be crypto income eventually, or partially crypto income, but they basically have some proof of income in the middle, right? And one of the things I point out in the book is that the census was actually, did you know the census is part of the US Constitution, like the post office?
I did not know.
So it's actually, it's actually something that they thought of as actually being very important from the very beginning. They needed information about their young republic in order to do something. It was a huge undertaking, which is why the census is only done every 10 years, because you have to take all this paper and, I don't know if you've ever seen what a million pieces of paper looks like, but it's a lot of pieces of paper, right? And you didn't have Excel. You had to add up all of that by hand. Every crosstab had to be done by hand. Just imagine the warehouse and how people had to set it up, right? So now our census, you can do something, not a million people every 10 years, but like Facebook in theory could compute and does actually have a real-time census on 3 billion people in a second. Okay. So that's like several orders of magnitude. If you go, just think it out, right? 3,650 days is 10 years. And then you're doing that not in an hour, but in a second. That is like, 6 or 7 orders of magnitude improved in terms of your speed to go from 10 years to 1 second, right? And the point about that is, now the problem is not the speed of the computation, but the reliability of it. Okay, how do you know? Before it was something where, okay, is the US government going to fake their census? Okay, maybe you trust them, maybe you wouldn't. But now anybody can put whatever number they want online. So this census for a network state, you're going to need a lot of the proof of X, proof of Y techniques we've talked about, like proof of human, proof of income, proof of real estate. All those things, actually, the cryptographic proof that transaction occurred with many different overlapping points of evidence, any one of which could be fallacious, but combined together, you get statistical inference, right? You have some estimate of, how probable is it that this number is correct, right? It's not going to be deterministic, it's going to be statistical. Even Bitcoin, for example, the calculation that Satoshi put in the white paper is a statistical calculation of, how likely it is that, you're going to have finality after like 6 blocks. And so you do the statistical calculation, you're like, how reliable are these population and income and real estate footprints? And if that census is reliable, if you have managed to build a community that's like this, and there's more details that I talk about in the book, but if you can build something at this scale of all these people who think of themselves as being part of the same nation and who actually crowdfund territory and live together in it. And if you notice the buildings, if you go put the GIF back on screen, those the buildings on the left-hand side sort of increase in complexity. So, right, the footprint starts getting larger in each of these cities, right? It starts as like just one guy in his house, and eventually it becomes cul-de-sacs and ranches and small towns and maybe even small cities, and they're all networked together. And when I say they're all networked together, the advent of augmented reality glasses, which I talk about coming, that's like the most predictable next thing in tech. Like the iPhone was this convergence device, the AR glasses that you tap and then just boom, you can just see ghosts from the internet in real life. Those are going to make it much easier to network all of these different physical regions together into something that feels like the same country, right?
So just to give you, let me ask you a question about this, because I think the number one critique, I was trying to think of like, what are the biggest critiques I've heard of people saying around this network state thesis? And the number one thing that I've seen people talking about is, okay, theoretically, this makes a ton of sense, but you still have to have the physical location, whether it's a building, whether it's land, whether it's whatever. How do those individuals in that building or land defend themselves from the existing nation state structure? So if you participate in a network state, how does that interface with the nation state? And do nation states view this as a threat or abrasive, or do they embrace it? Like how do you think about those two, or maybe the line between the nation state and the network state blurring in the physical world, where the network state still needs physical space?
Great question. So actually, I've got a whole section on this that I will add and then tweet out called diplomatic relations, right? Because I talk about diplomatic recognition as this core part of it, right? So diplomatic relations between network states and nation states is actually, you know what it's similar to? It's similar to the crypto fiat interface.
Okay. Explain.
Because it's like the interface between cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and fiat currency, the US dollar, was not something that actually, to my knowledge, at least, Satoshi wrote about originally. He sort of thought that the crypto economy could bootstrap itself kind of completely on its own. He had like the poker thing that was built into the app at the beginning, right? But it turned out that the BTC USD interface, that exchange rate, once that exchange rate occurred, right? And you could argue it occurred implicitly with the Pizza Day transaction, right? But the exchange rate between BTC and USD, that is, like future historians will see that as something that almost looks like it went 0 to 1, right? Like it looks infinite, or like it just goes vertical because it's very fast over a short period of time. But while we're living through it, as you know, it has ups and downs and it retraces and so on and so forth. Before, like maybe it'll go to infinity. We'll see. Okay. But the thing is that, so this image, by the way, here, this shows a visual of what I'm talking about, where if you scroll down, right, that's Apple's AR kit, which is a preview of what you'll see with your AR glasses. So if you hold a certain NFT, you see a glowing sigil. You're part of this secret society, this Freemasons or what have you. And all the people who have that NFT can see that sigil, and nobody who doesn't can, right? And that means that you have a layer over the world where citizenship becomes like single sign-on. You have a private key, you have an NFT that is your digital passport, and you can literally see aspects of the world that others can't. It's like your physical login, right? And so you can start to see how with something like that, you can take all these territories around the world. And, brand is kind of an unfortunate term because it seems very corporate, but think about if you walk into the Google offices anywhere in the world, they're basically very similar. They're meant to be similar. It's got the Google logo. Maybe there's like a little ethnic touch for that country, like the Google Doodle, but they're fundamentally very similar. And that's intentional. It's like a little piece of Google, a slice of Google around the world. But that's within the context of commercial real estate. These are all fundamentally commercial buildings, office space. What if you extended that to residential real estate and industrial, and you had all of those linked together, and it wasn't a company, but a community that owned them, right? That you could do. And then the branding would be more like, you have a bunch of Chinatowns, for example, or little Indias around the world, but they're networked together. And now you actually start having something which nothing I'm describing is like technically infeasible. All these little subroutines exist, right? Chinatowns exist, little Indias exist, Google exists, single sign-on exists, all those pieces exist, right? What I'm kind of talking about is the system integration of bringing them together into this, community that is physically distributed, but digitally connected in one place. And one way of thinking about this, by the way, is if you live in Hawaii, many people, they think of themselves as part of the same country as somebody who lives in New York. Okay. They're not driving to New York. In fact, they probably don't go off the island of Hawaii that frequently. So that GIF that I just showed is actually not that different from how people live already. You don't need that much contiguous space in the middle. It's not flyover country. It is, there's probably some clever one-liner you could have, but it's like teleport over a country, because you're just sending the packets over, and so these other regions are as, so long as your individual pockets are large enough, and that depends, a person in just like one place on their own could kind of think of themselves as like just like an American expat living overseas thinks of themselves as American, even if they're surrounded by a lot of foreign nationals, right? Like a building that had just one person from a network state, that person would LARP themselves into thinking of themselves as part of this larger community. And once it gets to on the order of 100,000 to 1 million people, if and when it gets there, it's actually not that unreasonable a LARP. And the reason for that is that most countries are small countries. Actually, here's another graphic from the beginning of the book that I'll show you.
In some way, what you're describing, there are crumbs of it already occurring.
Yes.
Google is a good example, right? In terms of like, you think of yourself as, I adhere to this community, which happens to be a for-profit company. There's physical space. There's a single sign-on to get into the internal systems. But you also can kind of extrapolate that out, and you see people doing this in a variety of different ways. It's just no one's done it from an actual nation state, transitioning to a network state, if you will.
Right. And so if you take a look, for example, at this, just here's a way to calibrate like the reasonableness of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you go and look at this link that I just pasted in and scroll all the way down to the bottom, most countries are small countries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Only 14 countries are 100 million person countries. And the reason that is counterintuitive is probably most people live in big countries,
Mm-hmm.
but most countries are small countries, right? And so the thing about that is most of the countries at the United Nations are like, sub 10 million, right? And as you know, we can build social networks of that scale. It's not trivial to build a 10 million person social network, but it's definitely doable. And there's definitely a lot of people who have built 100K, 1 million person followings online, like you and I are at that level. That's not like that exceptional, right? And so now, of course, there's a huge difference between like clicking a button and following somebody versus actually going and having a much higher level of commitment to think of yourself as part of a country.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the horizontal scale, we're there, right? Like we've got massive horizontal scale for like joining Facebook. And now, the next level up from that, from spending hours and hours a day on something, which is actually a pretty big commitment, by the way, I should say. The next step up from spending hours a day on a social network is starting to invest huge chunks of your net worth, like even 1% of your net worth, I would consider a huge chunk, into a cryptocurrency. And so we may have billions of people spending hours on social media. We have hundreds of millions of people putting big chunks of their net worth into cryptocurrency. And so the next question is, will we have some significant fraction of people putting their lives into a crypto country?
Mm-hmm. When you think of this, right? So use me as an example. I live in the United States of America. Many people would say it's a great place to live. People from all over the world want to constantly come here. There's the American dream. There's democracy. There's capitalism. There's all these kind of unique blend of things. And let's say that that's on one end of the spectrum. Then there's going to be individuals who are in a place where they're trying to leave, right? And they have a unique blend of both advantages and disadvantages as to why somebody may want to stay or leave in that country. But if you put that spectrum out, like what changes for somebody in a Western developed nation if they want to kind of transition into one of these crypto states? And what changes for the individual who is not in a Western developed nation but wants to transition into a crypto state? Like, do they end up in the same place? They just came from two different kind of starting points?
It's a good question. So the thing is, so the way, there's a lot of things I can say there. So the first is the US is becoming less attractive as a destination for so-called high net worth individuals. It's down about 86% since 2019. Henley Global has a report on this. They're also leaving China because, it's like the common prosperity doctrine over there. They've cracked down on Jack Ma and all the tech founders and so on. They're leaving Russia. Obviously, that's got the massive global outflux. They're leaving India, though they're getting replenished within India by like new founders, but it's, I think it's like net zero. But where they're going to small countries. And this has been a trend that's been going on for some time. And I think, so it's not, the other thing is also like the concept of the developed world and the developing world. This is something which I think it's now probably worth deconstructing that. And the reason is that the way I talk about it is the ascending world and the descending world, or the ascending class and the descending class. That's the individual version of it. So the reason I say that is, so here is, do I want to call this an unfair comparison? I think it's partially fair, but take a look at this.
This is an underrated Twitter account, by the way.
Underrated account, yeah. So look at her comment, right? So at first glance, I thought this was India, right? Now here's the thing: a lot of people jumped on her for that, right? And the thing is, India, there's parts of India that did look like that do look like that. But then if you go forward, here are some of the new Indian train stations.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's clean, and that's like a random train station that people use. Go to the next one, right? Like the thing is, I'm not saying that all of India looks like this and so on, but parts of India do, and parts of America now look like the previous thing. And so the distributions that were totally disjoint, in the 80s, that were basically like the richest Indian was poorer than the poorest American. Those are now like converging, right? Or
is it an equilibrium is found where like I don't really know how else to describe it other than like the United States was on this epic rise. At some point, it just can't keep going up higher and higher because people get complacent, people get comfortable. And so naturally you would expect decline at some point. These other countries now are the US, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they're now on ascent. And so you get that crossover point where the US doesn't keep improving and growing. These other countries catch up. And then you actually get the reverse. Like, is there a point in the future where India is, the new US and America is the old India?
Yeah. So, right. So basically, when I think about India, by the way, I'm only moderately bullish on India as a country, but I'm very bullish on Indians as a network,
yes,
like around the world, including Indians within India, but basically Indians in general are just like leveling up, and they're having an impact on the world. I mean, it's like
they run every tech company. I mean, they run every major tech company, right? Or at least 60% of the top ones.
Yeah. And this is, well, I mean, they've done very well there. And they've also, Indians have done well in media and other places. And this is this huge new phenomenon where I think, so one way of thinking about it is if you look around your room and you're like, okay, how much of this physical world was made by, effectively Chinese people in factories, right? Or, Chinese entrepreneurs. I think you're going to see over the next 10 years, a very large fraction of the digital world will be made directly or indirectly by Indians.
Interesting.
Okay, so like an interesting kind of way of thinking about it, right? And that's obviously like at the CEO level and so on. But I think an underrated thing is micro work, outsourcing and like machine learning labeling of like cat and dog, the digital assembly line, the digital blue collar on Android phones for cryptocurrency. But basically, where we're doing it but like 10, 100, 1,000, a million X bigger. That is going to be a big thing. Where you just open up your phone and you can do micro work anywhere for cryptocurrency, like a Twitter feed, right? And I think a lot of that is going to happen in India because it just kind of fits how people just, think about things there, right? They're willing to do these sort of, drudge type tasks. They've just got Android phones. They've got information, but like, $1 a day is still like a big deal for people there. So they will actually do a good job for something like that. And also, I think this is a part that's not appreciated. My friend Akshay, who actually, I think he coined this term, is basically like Indians used to need the H-1B visa, but now they have the TCP/IP visa. Okay, so he has this podcast. That's pretty good. That's pretty good, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And the thing is, like H-1B visas, they're down and up, and it seems like down and harder to get recently. But the thing is, now you have these graphs. Again, this is stuff that hasn't really been reported in the US. But if you look at the adoption of 4G or 5G rather, this is something which is just really kind of not on people's radars. While the US was kind of fighting this domestic civil war during the Trump years and all attention was on the domestic kind of thing, almost 1 billion people got online in India from 2017 to 2021. And that's continuing, right? So what that means is all those folks are lurking in the comment section. They're all reading, right? And so a good chunk of your upvotes are Indian. A good chunk of your readers and listeners are going to be Indian. And in fact, most of the English internet is going to soon be Indian because
one of the best examples I have of this is in 2015 or 2016. I went to India. I did like a 2-week trip and went to multiple cities. And I kept meeting entrepreneurs, and they'd come up to me and they'd say, hey, we've built X product. We have 100,000 users. And I remember being like, holy shit, like 100,000 users. And after like the 9th or 10th time, I turned to somebody who was there and I was like, how the hell are these people so good at growth? And he was like, no. Like 100,000 users in India is like 5,000 in the United States, right? He's right. It's just a bigger country or whatever. And so I remember like that was one of these things where I was like, oh, literally the scale of the opportunity just to get people in your local economy onto these products is going to be massive. Imagine if they're then able to scale them globally, like they are just used to building for scale and getting users in a way that is probably more difficult in the United States. And so it was just like this one little thing that just stuck out to me of like, man, this is so different than kind of the United States in the way that we think about, consumer products and growth.
Right. And the thing is that basically the integration of India with the global economy via the internet is a massive pro-globalization force. Mm-hmm. Going back to our earlier thing, like there's 1 billion people who really want to work online for money and are willing to do so and can do art and computer programming and social media and blah, 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 like lots and lots of white collar digital labor kinds of jobs. They don't need an H-1B visa anymore, and they're culturally acclimated. So, they may speak with an accent, but they kind of know all the memes, right? They're fluent in the memes. They've been growing up with the same memes. They've been lurking for the last 5 years and kind of learning all of that stuff. So, the first time I realized this was actually in the early 2010s when I taught this huge online course, massively open online course. Actually, when the first I think courses on Bitcoin. Here, let me show you this. I'm not sure most people even know about this. But in 2013, when Bitcoin was at double digits, I taught this course and actually hit 250,000 people worldwide. So yeah, this is 2013, right? Build Bitcoin crowdfunding. So 250,000 people, when Bitcoin was at like $10 or something, or not 10 bucks, it's like double digits, like I think it was $60 or something at that time. So the point being that what I realized with that course is that the internet was to America as America was to the UK. It is like the more global, the more like internationalist, like, the UK had all these innovations like, obviously common law, like all Englishmen are equal and, many civilizational innovations. And then the US leveled up and it said, hey, we're actually going to have a written constitution. And it's not just all Englishmen are equal, but all Europeans can come and immigrate and so on. And, that built this amazing country. And then, the next level, I think, is to go from common law to constitution to, cryptocurrency or to a smart contract, where it's not just like a written law with some judge who could enforce it, as they see fit, but something where there's a compiler that's enforcing it. There's a chain that's enforcing it. It's actually more difficult to abuse, and it's more impartial, a computer enforcing the law. And it's also something which is not just limited to those people who can get a visa in or something, but it is anybody with an internet connection, which is basically everybody. We've enfranchised billions of people. The phone is the next franchise in a real sense, because you've given all these people who didn't have a voice. You've given them all a way to make money online, to build things. And when you started putting all of that together, you're like, oh, okay, like the internet is to the Americas. It's like this new world. Like what the New World was for the Europeans. And it is something that I don't think people have realized its full potential and how large it is yet. As much as we talk about it, we still haven't really conceptualized it as such, because, the New World was seen but for many years by the European powers as just being the place for them to go and send boats. And of course, obviously the Native Americans and South Americans, Mayans, Incas, I actually talk about that in the book, like, there was a lot of warfare, and there's different ways that one can think about that. But the internet is different, where there's nobody on the other side. It's like there's nobody who's sitting on that server before you. It's a piece of just bare digital territory. So people think of it as just a place that America or Europe or India or China or what have you is just going to, quote, settle and build American tech companies or Chinese tech companies. But over time, I think it takes on a logic of its own and has its own internet native nationalism, where things like keto, for example, or CrossFit or Bitcoin are internet native things that are in a sense genuinely international because they cut across all international boundaries and will eventually be able to acquire territory and form new nations of their own. And that's a big part of what the book is about.
Well, it's the addressable market is much bigger. I also think a lot about you and I have talked about media, a bunch of times, but I think there's many industries where I call it like the boardroom expansion plan, which is like I build a company in the United States and I work really hard for 3 or 4 years, and then at some point I sit down with the board and I say, okay, board, I think now is time for international expansion. And we all debate and we pick like, let's go to England, right? Or let's go to, Mexico or like wherever we want to go. And it's like this very kind of methodical, global expansion plan. And some of that's because, if you're doing manufacturing or supply chain related things, there's a physical element.
But you need the regulations, certifications for those.
Yeah, but we've even seen this with just tech companies, right? I mean, there was a big deal when like Airbnb said, hey, we are going to go into a certain geography. And I think what has happened now is just like people turn it on as a global effort. And look, I was at Facebook when internet.org was a big focus of the business. And they were trying to bring internet. And the joke always, kind of was like, hey, we're running out of people on Facebook. So like, let's go get more people on the internet to get them on Facebook. And there probably was some hint of truth to it. But I do think that most of the effort was genuine in like giving people internet access is a net positive. Google at the same time was flying, hot air balloons and doing all this stuff. But if you fast forward now and you say like those internet companies are going to actually lose that internet race to Starlink and SpaceX. And it was, it was somebody who started in a completely different industry, realized I have an advantage. Now I'm going to be able to put this satellite constellation out there. And like, how impactful will Starlink be to getting more people on the internet, which then leads to more economic productivity in this digital world? Like, you can just see the pieces starting to come together. And sure, there could be external shock or kind of something catastrophic that drastically slowed internet adoption or, economic productivity on the internet. But like, that's pretty hard to see right now. The writing's on the wall, it seems, and we're only headed in one direction, which is more people on the internet, more people coordinating and doing economic commerce there. And so naturally, you would think that that's where kind of power, influence, wealth, et cetera, all gravitates as well, if that's what people spend all their time doing.
Yeah, I want a word that's like disenfranchised, but for taking away internet, it's like disinternetized or something like that. I could probably come up with something, because all these folks who have now gotten their phones, who've gotten their laptops, who've gotten their voices and their crypto and so on and so forth, states will want to take that away. And that's actually why you're seeing this push in the US and in the CCP for censorship, for crackdowns, for deplatforming, for demonetization, for disinformation, all that stuff is an attempt to kind of shove the genie back into the bottle, to take away speech from people and so on and so forth, and to kind of stop this internet thing from getting somewhere. And, I'm not saying those will be completely necessarily failed. I actually, unfortunately, think it might actually work. This so-called counter decentralization could work in China, but I don't think it's going to work in the West. And actually, to your question of will it get like stopped or what have you? Do you want my scenario for kind of like here's my base case model. And one thing I want to say about the book, I'm going to actually edit it to kind of make it, more obvious. The way I think about it is it's set up as problem and solution. Okay. So the problem is based on kind of my worldview, which is, if you take my reading of past, present, and future, I think we're headed for American anarchy and Chinese control. That is to say that the US is going to be potentially falling into some conflict between wokes and Bitcoin maximalists, who we could talk about, but basically I think that is sort of where things are headed. And I think that, so that's like what I call American anarchy. And it'll get pretty crazy, potentially one of the things I talk about is an attempted Bitcoin seizure, like an executive order 6102 that puts puts the state in a collision course with the network. And that's the only way they can finance the government after years more of printing and inflation and so on. They try to do some kind of Bitcoin seizure. And states resist this. There's states that have passed anti-seizure bills. This is one scenario. That's the American anarchy scenario where things get kind of crazy there. On the other side is Chinese control. And whether it's in response to, Roger Garside has this book called China Coup, where he basically talks about how he thinks there'll be a coup in China and democracy will take over. Whether that coup happens organically or is attempted by, or the US helps back it or whatever, just like, Biden saying Putin must, leave power, or, the various regime change things that have been tried, whether it happens organically or it's US backed or who knows, some combination. If something like that is attempted, and Garside and others are kind of advocating for it, Soros has kind of talked about something like this, the China crackdown will be insane, because that's the thing they're set up to go against. And they'll use AI to rip civil society out by the roots. Anybody who's near anybody who is possibly related to somebody involved in some kind of crazy, like a coup attempt, it'll just be ripped out by the roots. You might see Chinese nationalist mobs running around on the internet or even in person against this. And so they will have a total potential crackdown, Chinese control. And in that scenario, that software to control, basically the entire population then gets exported to every country that China has hard power in, all these African countries, but also, lots of countries in sort of the border zone that could swing in, the American or Chinese direction. And so between these two things, between American anarchy and Chinese control, you kind of want neither. Okay. Anarchy is really bad. Anarchy is, in my view, something that people think is good, but even crypto anarchy is certainly better than nothing, but it's not that great. And the reason it's not that great is there's many goods that cannot be reduced to a peer-to-peer transaction. Yes, I can buy bread or milk or something like that potentially from you, but what I can't buy is a high trust neighborhood and a peaceful walk through the street without bullets whizzing past my head, right? If you have a guy in Syria and he's got $10 million in Bitcoin, you know what he wants? He wants a ticket out of there, or he wants peace. Those are collective goods, maybe obviously, but this is something where the totally peer-to-peer model of the world doesn't account for those kind of collective goods where people all have to sort of sacrifice some autonomy for a collective good that everybody has. It's almost the opposite model of, the communist who cannot see the need for individual self-interest, and they only talk about the collective. This is the exact opposite of that, which is only talking about individual peer-to-peer transactions and not talking about anything that's, collective or whatever. Okay. So between these two things, between anarchy and tyranny, between American anarchy and Chinese control, I think we need to build a re-centralized center. And the reason I say re-centralized is it's the least popular word on the planet. Okay. Why? Because there's centralized and then there's decentralized, right? So centralized is the US establishment and the CCP with their crackdown, and the US establishment saying, hey, we may have printed all these dollars, we may have screwed all this stuff up, but we're still the legitimate representative of the flag. Why do you want to go into this maximalist anarchy? That's, questionable as to what's going to happen. It could be really bad. This is our country, we want to fight for it, et cetera. And that, I think, is what I call the green faction. If you take red versus blue and you splash yellow on both sides, green versus orange versus green is, I think, where it lines up. Dollar green versus Bitcoin orange. And that's the green faction's narrative, is centralization, just like the CCP. Then against both of those is the orange faction, BTC, which says decentralization. It says, screw you, you guys, did the China virus and you faked all the, news, and you printed all this money and you've minted all these cantillionaires, and you've basically built this entire fake system. There's a lot of merit to this, right? There's a lot of merit to the concept that there has been a ton of fakery and whatnot. And then the issue is that gets taken to the point of no leaders ever, right? All hierarchies are illegitimate. And, what was the saying, slay your heroes or something like that, which is basically, you've heard this kind of term, no?
Yep.
Yes, right? So what that is something where the maximalist actually overlaps with the woke, where they actually start to sound very similar. The woke says civility is tone policing, and the maximalist says toxicity is good, right? Or, the woke wants to abolish the police, the maximalist wants to, abolish the state. And whether it's we are all equal or you ain't the boss of me, even though there's tonal differences between them, the vector sum is nobody's in charge, right? Total anarchy, no leadership. And the thing is that the woke will constantly talk about fascism, 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 and they'll define themselves as anti-fascists against the upper right corner. They signal against that push to the lower left of the political compass. And what you're seeing to a greater extent are folks who define themselves as anti-communist, right? And of course, I'm against communism, but they define themselves as being against the upper left corner and point into lower right direction as ultra, ultra, ultra libertarian. And when you take those two vectors, when you take things that kind of point like this, the left and right kind of cancel out, but you have the sum is to the bottom, right? Have you done like vector math? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Like, nowhere near what you've done, but I know what it is.
You know what it is, right?
Yeah.
Once you think like, oh, actually these things, they do disagree on many aspects, but they both agree on is nobody should be in charge and the current order is illegitimate and rotted and should go away. Right?
Let me ask you about this, and we're going to wade into an area where I think there's plenty of people who have lots of opinions, both on the woke side and also on the Bitcoin maximalism side. How much of this is the Bitcoin maximalists care more about being a maximalist than care about the success of Bitcoin? The woke care more about the kind of camaraderie of everyone is woke together more than like the actual impact of achieving their goal. Like, is it a replacement for religion? Is it like the community and cultural aspect of it ends up transforming someone's identity, and the identity to this set of ideals is almost more important than the actual intended outcome? Or like, how do you think about that? Because to me, that feels like they both, it's very important to them that they are identified as part of the group.
Yeah. So I actually have this tweet thread from a little while ago that you might have there, right? Like, so basically, people who think they're supporting an issue online, I'm just going to read this, okay, for a second, then discuss it. Many folks who think they're supporting an issue online are really just taking direction from Twitter's algorithm. There's an unmistakable stylistic convergence of many different ideologies. What is rewarded is Twitterism. And what is Twitterism? The sick burn, the public feud, the sarcastic meme, the purity test, the hysterical mob. Some ideologies claim to be for tolerance. Others preach order or moderation, but Twitterism is none of these and is what actually happens. And even if you personally try to resist Twitterism, it doesn't matter. The most sarcastic tweets go viral. It can be 1% of your output, but 100% of what the world sees from you. And so, there are good parts of Twitter, but the internet increases variance. It amplifies the extreme good and bad. And Twitter is like a dispatch mechanism for our attention, the same way that Uber dispatches drivers to riders. And so the thing is that people are kind of hill climbing. So you've heard of like number go up technology, right? Yep. Well, what are the wokes about? They're about status go up, right? Wokes are, like kind of very roughly speaking, and this is just rough, right? But if you take the left-hand side of the political compass, they are more concerned with status and, academic position and political rank and politics and so on. And the right-hand side of the political compass is more concerned with economics and money and markets and so on and so forth. Very, high level, right? And so status go up technology is, the wokes developed this entire set of verbal armaments in academia where they could just stab you in online as you're a white male, haha, and what happens is it's like redistribution of status in real time, and one way of thinking about it is if communism was about the factory floor, and it was about the strike, and that was the collective action where you could get the hated boss to finally hand over all that money that they'd been hoarding. Now, what happened was it meant that you suddenly actually had a second boss, which is the union boss, and you actually had a whole second group of managers who are the mid-level managers, and now you actually had two managers, and you had to pay union dues. And it's not like the original company went away; it's just like this vampiric thing got attached to it, which is the union, and it sucked off some of the money, and it made the company less competitive. But it had the optics of like liberating the workers, even if it was like this barnacle that attached and didn't produce anything, it didn't take any risk, it just kept asking for more money and made the company less competitive. Fine, okay. But that was the thing though, is that in the very short run, the group of union workers were convinced that those strikes were making them money. Even if in the medium to long run, it was debiting in an invisible way from the competitiveness of the company, even if it was actually making them poorer in the medium to long run from the union dues and the fact that the union was then going to be controlling their speech and the union was going to be controlling their promotions and all that stuff. Like, even if all that was true, in the very short run, it gained them money. And that's actually one of the reasons that, unions proliferated. It seemed to give people a tangible good until in the long run, it didn't, right? And wokeness is kind of like that. Wokeness, it's not the factory floor that's a setting anymore because people aren't on the factory floor as part of their workday. Where are they on? They're on the internet, right? They're on the internet, they're on social media. And so what is wokeness? It's a collective action by all the people who accept those woke premises to go and gang up on somebody. And they're taking not their money from the boss, but the status from the oppressor.
And
right? Go ahead.
When people do this, is there a defense mechanism? Is there a way for the non-woke to either resist, to fight back, to just ignore? Like how do you look at the other side of the equation?
Extremely good question. And I've thought about this a lot and whatnot. And in some ways, it's actually like a virus in its own way, where it had to partially like go through the population for you and me to both know what wokeness is, for the audience to know what it is, for us to have a word for it. I mean, one thing, by the way, the wokes themselves didn't come up with the word woke. In fact, they hate it. They try to scratch off the label all the time, right? And it's funny because everybody else is labeled with something. Like wokeness is all about coming up with labels for everything else, pathologizing it, problematizing it, and so on and so forth. Everything else is labeled and named and analyzed and verbalized to very verbal, except for wokeness itself, right? Which is sort of the, you ever seen Indiana Jones, like the scene where he like swaps out the idol, in yes. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So wokeness is like the combination of Foucauldian deconstruction with civil rights ideology, where it like takes away, it first says everything is relative, there's no morality, and then this is what's good, right? And it's basically like a radicalized version of civil rights, kind of stuff, but it's not even equal rights. It's just it is to equal rights what communism is to treating your workers well. It is something that claims to be for that, but is actually not that. Communism claims to treat workers well, but put them in the gulag, right? Wokeness, claims to, treat people equally, but you get like, BLM burning, black businesses down and so on, right? And so hopefully I can say this because, it's true. And it's something where, if you look at the history of communism, it was actually terrible for workers. By the end, you had this situation with Solidarity where Solidarity was trying to strike. That was actually part of what brought the, Soviet Union down, is that they were cracking down on the group that they were supposed to be for, the workers' paradise. The Soviet Union is cracking down on the workers. This, I think, is also going to be the big problem with woke capital and why it's not going to live very long, is all this inflation that's happening, all the dollars that are being printed, it's hitting non-whites the hardest, right? If you look at, inflation numbers, the Hill actually has the study like inflation, hitting non-white people the hardest. So what's going to happen, what's already happening is it's hitting the coalition that they claim to be enriching and speaking for, is just like the workers under communism were actually impoverished and harmed. The printing under woke capitalism is going to hit and hurt non-white people very, very badly, much worse than they were under the previous system, the pre-woke system, which had its flaws, but was better than wokeness. And so that I do think is delegitimizing, but then that doesn't mean that anything that replaces it is necessarily good. I certainly agree with the maximalist critique of, inflation or things, but I also do think that the answer is not just total decentralization and crypto anarchy, but rather re-centralization under opt-in leaders. And some maximalists, by the way, would, I think, agree with me on that. But it's a spectrum. It's just like with wokeness, where does woke end, and simply just somebody who's liberal or progressive or whatever, where does that begin? And that's the reason it works, right? The reason it works is you have somebody who is genuinely tolerant, and then somebody who says all the same things, but uses it to be intolerant.
The last thing I'm going to say here, and then I know we're running out of time a little bit, but sure. I always go back to this idea of so many of the problems in the world, and whether it's Bitcoin maximalist or kind of Fed critics or whoever, they all kind of arrive at the same conclusion, which is we don't have free markets, and free markets have kind of been co-opted and taken over by ideologies, by these social focuses, by everything other than like free market capitalism, right? And if you believe in free markets and their ability to self-correct and kind of eventually find the answer, optimizing for anything other than let the free market do its thing is obviously intervention and would prevent the free market from operating. And so what I think is a unique way to present Bitcoin or other types of technologies that follow similar ethos is that it's trying to implement free market dynamics again, but do it in a way where they cannot be co-opted. Like, yes, somebody can go and manipulate the Bitcoin price, right? But if you're just a large holder or whatever, but they cannot change fundamentally what Bitcoin is. They cannot take over the network. They cannot change the programmatic monetary policy. They cannot do these things. And so it goes back to like the classic Google, like don't be evil, can't be evil, right? Type nomenclature. If we were successful in implementing free markets where people could not take them over, would the world be a better place? It's up for debate, but I think there's a strong argument that the free market would definitely self-correct.
Okay, so let's say that I probably agree with almost, with much of that, right? The only thing is, do you know the difference between open loop versus closed loop control?
No.
Okay, so like in control theory, let's say that you had a car, okay, and you close your eyes and you just hit the gas. Okay. That's like open loop control. There's no feedback. Okay. But closed loop control, you have your eyes open and you're looking at the road and you're making micro corrections and steering the wheel left and right and so on and so forth. And so you're making micro corrections constantly, sometimes a little bit left, sometimes a little bit right. And that's keeping you on the straight and narrow to get there. And if it's a complicated and long direction, you can't just keep the thing veering left or keep the thing veering right and hope to get there. Okay. As a second metaphor that I think is also related, imagine that somebody was a Westist. Why are they a Westist? Because they liked the idea of California. Okay. So they just kept going west. And then they got to California, and then they had people in the group say, we have to keep going west. What, are you some kind of cuck? You don't want to be, we got to keep going west. Well, aren't you a Westist, right? You're going east now? You're in California. And so then they keep going west, they land in the Pacific Ocean. Okay. And so the point is that an ideology that is just a direction is going to insist on a purity that is actually a stupidity, because you really want to optimize for destination, not consistent direction. You can go too far left, you can go too far right. You have to actually be able to steer. And so it may be the case that at this point in time, I agree that one should steer right or steer left or up or down or something else, right? Like there's more than just two directions also. But you have to have some vision of what that destination is. And moreover, as you know, as a startup investor, just the words that somebody writes in a slide deck, there's 1,000 micro corrections that they have to make on the steering wheel, 10,000, 100,000 between that slide deck, their words and their vision and their actual destination, And so simply saying it on the internet, it's like, it's a starting place, but the execution, the implementation of that concept require many pragmatic compromises with reality. And so that's actually one of the things I talk about in the book is basically, I do believe in moral entrepreneurship in the sense that I do believe people should, and I think tech entrepreneurs have actually only done this implicitly. It's not just about a technological innovation, it's about a moral innovation. It's not just about a failure in the market, it's a failure in society that one wants to fix. You don't just have something that is a better mousetrap, you have something that's a better world. But how do you actually prove that that's actually a good moral innovation and not a bad one? Because just like most tech companies fail, most things don't actually work in the market. Many moral innovations, like the communists had a moral innovation, which is profit bad. The profit used to be considered good. Then they said, hey, what happens if we say profit is bad? It turned out to be a very bad door to go down, but hundreds of millions of people were enslaved, 100 million died before you fix that, right? Other moral innovations like, cigarettes bad or smoking bad, before cigarettes were acceptable or even good, then flipped to bad. I argue that was probably on balance a good intervention. And then yet still others like prohibition, which said alcohol bad, and then it got flipped back to alcohol acceptable, right? That was, neutral to negative, that the prohibition thing. But you can also argue that alcohol does cause still a lot of crimes, DUI, et cetera. So you can argue that point. Maybe you want not a coercive prohibition, but a dry society. You can argue that point. Okay. So the thing is, if you have a moral innovation, if you have a strong moral position, then what you want to do, and I talk about this in the book, is build society as a service, right? Prove that you're right by actually going, let's say you're Maximus, you go and build your citadel, and you bring people in, society as a service. And the 1,000 things that can't fit in a tweet, all the decisions that you actually have to make about a real society, like what are the laws going to be? Are there going to be police? Is there going to be any central government of any kind? All this type of stuff you actually will have to go and figure out in your society as a service. And you'll have to make pragmatic concessions to reality that one does not if one is just, kind of popping off, right? And that's kind of how I think about it is you want to give people the ability to morally innovate and technologically innovate. They build these societies as services. And the way that there's a check on their legitimacy is that people choose to come and they choose to stay. And if they don't like it, they can choose to leave and they can choose between others of these kinds. And, they can tour it online. That's why the digital component is so important. They can tour it online cheaply so they can go and comparison shop and then find the best ones. But with that said, I do think there's a big difference between those folks who will build these societies and those folks who are the consumer, citizens. I do think there's a good thing about comparison shopping between jurisdictions, but that's like, the difference between buying an iPhone, building an iPhone is much harder. And so the folks who are going to build these jurisdictions cannot simply be the consumer citizen. You have to be much more missionary than quote unquote, mercenary, right? So this is how I think you can actually prove that your online morality is right. Build a society oriented around that. See what it actually looks like when you materialize it. Just like a theory of math or computer science, you actually sometimes need to write the code to see if it works. And then you can show that it's attractive and you've actually made the right trade-offs. Or it might be something that only works when you can be in the back row throwing stones or online throwing stones, and doesn't work if you actually go and declare yourself president of a startup society and try and build one.
When you think about kind of these theories as they continue to come together, put a probability. I don't know, next 10 years, what's the probability that we see a network state in a 10-year period? And then what's the probability we see it in a 50-year time period?
It's a great question. I mean, I want to actually bring this into fruition. So
I'm playing on your rational and optimistic sides.
Sure. Well, I mean, this thing, as we've talked about, there's actually a lot of proof points towards this. We have billion-person social networks. We have billion-person crowd funds. We have massive online meetups. We have, remote work, and all that stuff is now mainstream. We have dissatisfaction with the establishment, blah, blah, blah. There's like many, many different things where it's quote, just systems integration. But, let me put it like this. Do I think it is possible? 10 years ago, in 2012, I think, what was the price of Bitcoin? It was $10 or something like that, right? So a lot can happen in 10 years. An enormous amount can happen in 20 years. 20 years ago, 2002, Google was around, it's true, but it was pre-Facebook, it was pre-iPhone, it was pre a lot of things. Even the internet age, as we normally think about it, really, I think only truly started post-iPhone. There's a great book on this, but until basically 2008, Google, was the only company that was making money on the internet. Microsoft didn't really think of the internet, thought of Google. And Apple was not solely an internet company, it was a gadget company. And that was before Airbnb and Uber. So all this stuff, this entire internet economy is about like less than 15 years old, maybe 13 years old. So an enormous amount can happen in 10 years. And do I think it is possible that you could have a startup society that, my phases, by the way, of emergence are, you have a startup society, which is a guy, person declares himself, just like you declare yourself CEO of a new startup company, you declare yourself president of a new startup society, and you have one person. And then you recruit people online for that. You build it to 10 and 100, and then you start organizing them into what I call a network union, which takes, the big difference between a network union and a normal online community is the network union is capable of collective action. Seems like a small thing. It's actually a huge thing. It basically means that they are combining to achieve a goal, and they're actually doing that thing. Even if that's all just upvoting something, they start to actually get accustomed to sacrificing for the group and working together for a measurable cause where the group is stronger than the individual. Just getting 10 people to go and, help some member of the network union each day is a big deal. And you might start to have an internal currency of that network union because they don't just do normal union things like they might help somebody if they've got a conflict with their employer. That is a potential thing. But they could also do like group purchasing. They could help somebody with a launch. They could, help and crowdfund something. They're basically like a online community that helps you out, right? A network union. So that's digital. You get these people accustomed to doing collective actions, building trust, and so on. And eventually, that network union takes the next step to physical. And what does that mean? They start crowdfunding buildings. Maybe it's houses that 2 or 3 or 5 people live together in. Maybe it is apartment complexes that, if you have a large network union, 100 people can buy an apartment complex and suddenly they all have equity in the building where they wouldn't have had it before. When you have 100, streams of rent together, you have a different conversation with the building owner than if you have one, right? And doing all this means they have to sort of appoint a CEO or a president of that network union. It can't just be like an online community that, everybody's there for Game of Thrones. They actually have some sort of collective leadership. So you go from startup society to network union to what I call network archipelago. That is this global build out of lots of little physical pieces of territory that are knitted together. And then eventually, if you have enough population and enough income and enough real estate footprint, you can gain the diplomatic recognition from an existing state required to become a network state. And that might not be a sovereign, like, you might not have a France or whatever recognize you. You might start with a small country like a Tuvalu or a small city even, like Miami isn't that small a city, but, a Texas or a Miami or a Tuvalu. You don't have to have a huge national government do it. You could have a state or a city government or a small national government do it. And that first recognition, why do I think that's possible? Because you do have Tuvalu, signing deals with companies. You have Colombia signing deals with companies for the .tv and .co domains. You have El Salvador doing the Bitcoin deal, the Bitcoin deal, the Bitcoin as the national currency, right? You have, which is a big deal. You have Wyoming doing the Ethereum DAO laws. They're integrating with the Ethereum network that way. And so you have many proof points like this where you have states and cities and small countries that are doing deals with corporations or with networks and or with other groups. And so I do think all of those proof points are there. And I think if you have a large enough online entity that shows enough longevity, it's going to be rebuffed the first time. It's going to be laughed at for years. It's going to be thought to be crazy. But eventually, 5 or 10 or 15 years or sooner or later, I don't know, it will have the scale, I think, to achieve diplomatic recognition, especially if it's like more than 1 million people and it's bigger than, 20% of the countries in the UN.
I mean, it would be incredible if this happens. And I think your point about there are many, many proof points and kind of mini milestones that we can plot out that this seems to be the direction that we're going. If people want to learn more about the network state and read the book, where can we send them to find it? And then where can we send people to find you on the internet?
Great question. So if you go to thenetworkstate.com, so thenetworkstate.com. So first is that subscribe widget in the lower left. Go and subscribe because there'll be more chapters, free chapters, and so on. The whole thing is free online. You can read it online. You can download the PDF. If you want it on Kindle for offline, buy it on Amazon. I think it's a pretty decent experience on mobile. So, your Android phones and so on. So go there. And then otherwise, go to twitter.com/BalajiS, and you can follow me, and that is here. And I will return to tweeting soon.
Yes.
I've just been faving and RTing and stuff. I've been warming up, but it will begin. It's like
the return.
Yeah, something like that, right? So we wanted to basically, if you scroll up for a second in this, in the Zoom. Oh yeah, great. So that's me at Balaji S. And if you go, I should actually update the URL, but if you go back to thenetworkstate.com, so upper left corner, it's kind of a fun logo, right? Get it? New country. Haha.
Create
button.
Create new country.
Create country. Yes, exactly.
Right click. Let's go. All right. Listen.
No, left click. This is left click.
Left click.
Okay.
Listen, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think that you and I could literally sit here. I've actually thought that you and I one day should sit down and just go for 12 hours and just see like how much shit could we actually talk about? Because I enjoyed every single time.
when we get the hardcover out there with the 600, 700 pages, all the charts and stuff like that, we'll do a page flip and I'll just kind of call out what I think is cool.
Page by page.
Yeah, something like that. There you go.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know people will have learned a lot. I learned a lot, and we'll definitely do it again in the future. That was a fantastic conversation with Balaji. I could talk to him for many, many more hours. Don't forget that these episodes are brought to you by FTX US. FTX has very cheap trading fees, sometimes as much as 85% cheaper than any of their competitors. They also are testing digital stock trading, which will allow people to buy stocks in-app, but it won't have any transaction fees and no payment for order flow. Go check out FTX US today. Go click on the link in the description and get started. They'll also give you a bonus once you make your first couple of trades. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Balaji, and I'm looking forward to doing many more with him over the coming months.